I was shocked to see Aaron Mate on Megyn Kelly's show. Sometimes, journalists from the gray zone, they're not invited into certain spaces, right? Because some people say they tell a little too much truth, a little too inconvenient truth. But he was there. And I thought this was an interesting back and forth that they had about Venezuela. I'm very shocked that he was brought onto a serious radio show, because Megyn Kelly's show isn't just on YouTube. Obviously, it's a part of Sirius Radio, right? But I think people need to hear what was said. First and foremost, one of the things that Megyn Kelly says here is that she knows if she was still on Fox News, she would not be able to have this opinion that she has about the war right now. Listen to this.
I really think this is something we need to consider both sides on. I really do. Let me just tell you something. When I was at Fox News, which was a long time, 14 years, I would have known exactly what to do in the wake of Trump's attack in Venezuela, his retrieval, shall we say, to put it in mild terms, of Nicolas Maduro. I would have known that I was supposed to cheerlead it. And I turned on Fox News yesterday, and I'm sorry, but it was like watching Russian propaganda. There was nothing skeptical. It was all rah, rah, cheerleading. Yes, let's go. And that's fine. I love our military as much as anyone, and I believe in President Trump, but there are serious reasons to just exercise a note of caution before we just get on the rah, rah train. All right. I have done that enough times in my career as a Fox News anchor to have been embarrassed enough to know I'm going to stay on the yellow light for this. I'm not in the green light territory. I'm not in the red light territory either, but I am staying in the yellow light territory for now. I see all of the strategic advantages of what he's done. Trust me, I do. I see that other countries like Russia and China and Cuba were all over Venezuela and its oil, posing a potential threat to the United States. I get that. That's actually the most persuasive argument, and obviously the real one, and none of this bullshit about law enforcement. But I have seen what happens when you cheerlead unabashedly U.S. intervention in foreign countries, thinking it's for our good and for the international good, only to wind up with what we've called quagmire in places like Iraq, not to mention Libya. We're not great at going into these foreign countries, decapitating them at the leadership level, and then saying either we're going to steer the country to a better place or it's going to steer itself. Either one. They just, 9 times out of 10, they don't work out well. And what does it mean in terms of boots on the ground? Trump is saying, I'm actually fine with that in Venezuela. Well, whose boots? Because I have a 16-year-old boy, and I have a 12-year-old boy, and I have a 14-year-old girl. And a lot of my listeners have children too, who are actually the ones who might have to fill the boots. So I think I speak for a lot of moms and dads for that matter when I say I'm staying in yellow territory until we know more. And I will not be joining the Fox News cheerleading brigade this time. I've been burned too many times.
Okay. So basically what Megyn is saying is that if she was still a part of Fox News, she would have to give the same message about Venezuela that they are giving right now. And, she's not a part of them. She's part of Sirius, and she can say a little bit more here. But, at the same time, I get confused with Megyn Kelly because I feel like what she said there about obviously Fox News is toting the establishment narrative, the narrative that's also coming from the State Department, and she would be expected to do the same if she was still there. I understand that, but I do get confused with Megyn Kelly because I feel like if you can understand that and you can see that, then why couldn't you understand and see that when it came to the Epstein files? And why do you continuously try to make excuses about that particular issue? Right? And we've talked about that before on this show. So it's just weird to me. It's like you can get that far, but you're not willing to go a step further and really understand some of these other implications as well. Now, she did have this conversation with Aaron Mate. Like I said, I was very shocked that he was on her show, that she invited him on, because again, like he's going to tell a lot of truth. And sometimes that can be inconvenient, even for Megyn, who's no longer part of Fox News. Take a listen here.
So outline broad brush for us, if you will, why you object to what the United States did in Venezuela on Saturday morning.
Megyn, thanks for having me, and I appreciate you being open to a dissenting perspective on this. It's important we have debate. And in fairness to Fox News, it wasn't just Fox News that is cheerleading this. You could see so many major news networks cheering this on, CBS News and NBC. So this truly, which underscores that this is even though this is Trump's policy, it is bipartisan. There's been a regime change campaign going on in Venezuela by the U.S. for a very, very long time, which everybody in power has supported. And it's important to raise questions and to, challenge the assumptions that have been made to justify this campaign. The reason why I object to this is, first of all, I don't think we have the right to regime change foreign countries. We don't accept foreign countries interfering in the U.S. If we believe in the rule of law, international law, states being equal, states having rights, we don't have the right to go and overthrow a foreign government just because we don't like them. And in Venezuela in particular, it's obvious why we've been doing it. I mean, Trump, to his credit, has been very clear about this. It's for their oil. He said that on Saturday that we're going to take their oil under the so-called Monroe Doctrine. And I don't grant any state the right to do that. It's also going to have serious human consequences. As you mentioned earlier, people were already killed in this attack, which hasn't gotten very much coverage, but dozens of people at least were killed, including civilians inside Venezuela. And if this regime change campaign escalates, many more will be fated to die, including possibly, as you mentioned, U.S. soldiers who will be forced to go in and finish the job.
And I want to say something. That number continues to increase now. The amount of people that are estimated dead in Venezuela after that U.S. Attack there. And this is another thing I wish more people would wake up to. Donald Trump said, we got to protect these Christians that are in Somaliland, and we got to protect the Christian Nigerians and all this stuff, right? But this is another example. Venezuela is, from what I read, overwhelmingly Christian. Also, pretty conservative when it comes to social issues, but they just killed a bunch of Christians. So again, just another example that you can point to there. When it comes to regime change, this is something I think we all need to push back on. One person that I'll remind you of again, Miss Tulsi Gabbard, she's another one that to me, very quiet about all of this. And she has been preaching against regime change for quite some time. And so I think that what Aaron is kind of waking Megyn up to here is that, notice she mentioned Fox News, but what he's correcting her on here is he's saying, actually, it was all of corporate media. And he's right. This is bipartisan. That's why you don't see that many Democrat politicians coming out against it either. You would think overwhelmingly the party would say, no, this is wrong, yada, yada, yada. But no, they support it too. They support war. They support the war machine. They get the money from, these weapons manufacturers as well. They have donors that tell them you better support these damn wars. So that's the unfortunate part about it, is that both of those parties do support the war efforts. So that's something, again, I think that Megyn needs to kind of wake up to, is that it is bipartisan. This is not just a Trump thing. There are too many Democrats on the Democrat side that are supporting exactly what Donald Trump did. And I think that's very telling.
But this has been going on for a very, very long time. A brief history, Venezuela first faced a U.S.-backed regime change campaign back in the early 2000s when the Bush administration supported the ouster of Hugo Chavez, tried to install someone who tried to cancel the Constitution. That was reversed by popular uprising and loyalist military members. But the campaign has continued ever since. And it's been pursued in recent years with sanctions that have had devastating consequences to Venezuela, which then is subsequently used as a pretext to justify regime change. So, for example, there have been many migrants coming from Venezuela. And then if you listen to Marco Rubio, he says, this is one of the reasons why we have to intervene, because we have to stop this migration crisis. Well, what doesn't get mentioned by Marco Rubio and most media accounts of this is that the sanctions we imposed on Venezuela knowingly caused migration. Thomas Shannon, who served under Trump in his first term at the State Department, he warned at the time that, in his words, the sanctions were going to grind the Venezuelan economy into dust and have huge human consequences, one of which would be out-migration. And that's predictable. When you target a country's economy with crippling sanctions, especially Venezuela's oil industry, which accounts for most of its revenue, you're going to cause economic misery. And a lot of
Yep.
people fled that as a result. So then we take the migrants and the fact that they're fleeing, and we use that as a pretext to go and overthrow the government when it's the regime change effort to begin with that has caused this. So look, legally, I don't think we have the right to. And in terms of consequences, I just think this is a disaster for everybody, because as we've seen, regime change campaigns abroad have spillover effects everywhere, including inside the US.
Yeah. So this is a really important thing here that Aaron Monte just said. If you're complaining about immigration, you're complaining about migration, but at the same time, you're applauding imperialism, you're applauding intervention. I mean, you can't have it both ways. Because the reality is, imagine if it happened to you, if someone comes into your neighborhood and all of a sudden everything in your town just increases. Whether it's the price of gas, it's the price, like to the point where you really can't afford it, to the point where like maybe, aspirin, and now instead of being like $1 at the dollar store or the Dollar Tree or whatever, maybe now aspirin is like $50. Sanctions are economic warfare. So sanctions can kill people. So now that, especially when it comes to medicine, now that these things cost so much more, what are you going to try to do? You're going to try to go somewhere else where you can get those goods cheaper. So you really can't have it both ways. And I've tried to explain this to people multiple times. So you need to leave these countries alone, let them govern themselves, let them keep their resources. And we would not want to be in that situation. We would like it if another country came to the United States and just said, okay, from now on, we're taking over New York and Florida and California, and we're going to take over a couple of these states. And this is how things are going to go from now. We would be livid. We would be livid. So try to put yourself in their shoes.
The one thing I keep thinking about is before we got Gaddafi in Libya, and that place just turned into a hellhole, we were having sort of proxy fights with Libya. I mean, they weren't really proxy. It was kind of on the nose, but they were conducting certain terrorist operations against us. And then we conducted certain certain military operations against Libya. And it all culminated in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland by Libya. And that was one of my first introductions to international terrorism as a young woman, because I was starting at Syracuse University in 1988. And it happened that there were 35 Syracuse University students on board Pan Am 103. They had been studying abroad in London and were on their way home. And that flight had been targeted by Libya for terrorist activity back at a time when we weren't requiring bags to be identified with their passenger. You could put one on in one city and it would be transferred if the plane had a layover without any question that the person who owned the bag is no longer flying on board the plane. And that's how they managed to bomb this flight that brought down hundreds of Americans, killed hundreds of Americans, including 35 students at my own university where I just started. And it was something that I always remembered. I mean, we were there every 4 years. There would be the memorials. They were young people, 18, 19-year-old people with their whole lives in front of them. My point is,
do you see what Megyn Kelly tried to do there? Let's go back to what Libya did back in 1988, et cetera, right? But what has the United States government been doing, hell, my whole life or your whole life, or hell, just the past 15 years? So I think, you really need to compare the two. I don't like violence against anyone. But it is just kind of weird to me. It's like you can see that act and you can say that's terrorism, but you can't see the United States, the acts that the United States does abroad in all these other countries. You can't see that as terrorism. And I think that's the part to me that is just stunning, that you're not willing to go there. Because if you grow up with this mindset that Americans cannot be that way, that Americans cannot cause terror abroad, then that is part of the problem. And I think a lot of people have been conditioned to believe that.
Simply, you start these actions and you think, great, okay, like back at the time, they had attacked us. There had been terrorism by Libya. So of course we bombed them. Okay, great. Yes, go America. Again, put on your cheerleader uniform. They deserved it. Good for us. And now, you look at those parents of the 35 Syracuse University students, I'm sure they're not feeling so great about it. So that's just one example, Aaron, where you just don't know what you're starting. And our mutual friend, Glenn Greenwald, has been pointing out that it's very normal for the cheerleading to happen after an action like this. There's like a froth that builds up amongst the media. We love our military. We're proud of our guys for, superbly executing such a difficult and dangerous mission. Of course we are. And we're proud.
No, we're not. Like that's the thing. I don't, who is she talking to?
Out of the United States of America for being able to do that in a way that probably no other country can. But that doesn't really answer the bigger question about how is this going to come back to haunt us? And not just us, but our kids, our children.
Yes, because it's people on the ground who have to pay the price of these decisions made from above. I mean, how many people lost their lives in Vietnam and so many other countless wars that were a disaster for everybody involved. And if you look at some of the reasons that we get, so another reason, a major one that the Trump administration claims is Maduro is a narco trafficker. I mean, Megyn, you have a legal background. I'd be curious your thoughts if you've on the indictment and the strength of it. I mean, I noticed that one of the counts that Maduro faces is possession of machine guns, which I don't understand. I mean, first of all, I don't understand why it's a big concern for the U.S. that Maduro has machine guns, and to me, it speaks to kind of this not being such a robust indictment. But he's accused of being a narco trafficker, and again, I don't think the evidence supports that. And it's also a harder case to make when Trump recently pardoned a convicted narco trafficker in the same court that indicted Maduro. And in the New York court, Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, he was found to take a bribe from a cartel, $1 million. He was caught on tape vowing to stuff the drugs up the gringos' noses, quoting him. There was a prison murder tied to his case, and Trump pardoned him. So just as he's launching a regime change campaign, in the name of fighting narco trafficking, he goes and convicts and pardons a convicted narco trafficker. So this strikes me as as we saw with Iraq, the pretext there.
Pretextual.
Yes. The pretext there was Iraq WMDs, which didn't exist. And I think we're following a very similar playbook here. At least Trump has the honesty, unlike
I don't disagree.
To say this is about oil.
I totally agree with you that it's pretextual, that it is not about narco terrorism. I'm sure Trump does object to the amount of drugs coming our way from Venezuela. But of course, if you really want to crack down on countries that are sending drugs in the United States, you'll start with China and Mexico, not necessarily Venezuela. And to your point,
but pause here just a second, right? So again, as I said, what about the drugs that are pushed by the pharmaceutical companies? Like again, nobody has officially held the Sackler family accountable till this day. Yes, they had the hearings in Congress, but Richard Sackler is not in jail. So if it's really about what's going on here and what's happening to American people right here in this country, why aren't you going after big pharma? And I think the answer to that question is that a lot of the politicians take money from big pharma. Big pharma donates a lot of money to these politicians. So I think that's a big part of the problem. And so to me, it's just, I don't know. I will say, I think it's kind of good that Megyn did announce that she doesn't think that the rhetoric that is coming from corporate media about Venezuela is correct, and that it's not something that people should be readily cheering on. But I do also still feel like she is willing to give it the benefit of the doubt. And I just don't, like, for me, I don't want to hear anything else about drugs coming into the United States until these people are willing to tackle the drugs that are heavily pushed by big pharma, that disable people and that break people every day. So until we get to the point where people want to talk about people getting addicted to pills from big pharma, I just don't want to hear it.
He just pardoned this other guy who was obviously a party to that too. I agree that it's pretextual. It is about regime change. And I think he was being honest, though, when he said it's the Monroe Doctrine. That I believe. And if you look at that, I haven't spent a lot of time studying the Monroe Doctrine, I'm going to be honest, from our fifth president, that basically said, not in our hemisphere. Not in our hemisphere. You're not going to at the time it was Europe. You're not going to come and colonize anything in the Western Hemisphere, period. And we'll fight you if you do. And we did. We enforced that over years. And I was just kind of researching this morning, what was the constitutional authority for that? Like there wasn't really any. We kind of just made it up and said, we're just not going to allow it. And we've been doing it for 200 years now and getting away with it. And so I kind of understand his decision that forget the narco-terrorism stuff. He had to use that as a pretext to get around congressional approval and all the other, legal requirements that would be there if this were actually declared a war or a military invasion or incursion of some sort. I think it really is Trump saying not in our hemisphere. I've seen that Cuba's basically infiltrated Venezuela entirely. The relationship between those two has been totally interdependent, and they don't like Cuba, especially Marco Rubio. And China was there when we captured Maduro. They were getting closer and closer thanks to China's Belt and Road policy, where they're trying to inculcate themselves into various nations all over the world, including in South America, to make them less dependent on the United States and more dependent on China. And where that goes, we don't like. We don't know, but we know we don't like. And Russia too, with the oil. So I think that was the honest answer. We don't like it. Because one of the reporters said to Trump, Aaron, what about the oil? Like, why the oil? And he said, why don't you ask Russia that? Why don't you ask China that? They're the ones who are focused on the Venezuela oil. And I do believe that's his actual reason, which I guess I share in that concern of Trump's, that them getting a big foothold in Venezuela, the Chinese, the Russians, and Cuba, it's not a great thing for the United States of America.
Well, listen, I don't share that view, but regardless of what you think about Venezuela's choice of allies, I think the question for the U.S. government is, if you are imposing policies that are designed to destabilize a foreign government, which I would argue has been the focus of U.S. policy in Venezuela for more than 2 decades, starting with the coup I mentioned earlier, the coup attempt against Hugo Chavez, what do you expect a country to do? If you support the overthrow of a government, they're not going to be too enthusiastic about working with you, and they're going to choose other allies. And that's what I think happened in Venezuela. I think if the U.S. hadn't been trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government for more than 2 decades, I don't think they'd be as keen to embrace allies like Russia and China. Maybe they would be, but certainly if you are if you were supporting the overthrow of a foreign government, which what the Bush administration did under Hugo Chavez, and that's continued, again, under both parties. Under Obama declared Venezuela to be a national security threat to the U.S., which had the impact of deterring investment in Venezuela, because that's what, if the most powerful country in the world says that you're a threat, banks are not going to want to do business with you. And so all these actions have isolated Venezuela. And to the extent that they would be willing to cooperate with the U.S., they haven't been so keen about that, given the efforts at regime change there. Now, I personally think that states have the right to make the alliances that they want, but we don't have to agree on that. I think when you have decades of policy aimed at regime change, and the U.S. has spent a lot of money via agencies that Trump has actually criticized, via groups like the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, supporting the opposition in Venezuela. And so when you have a country doing that, I can understand why, in Venezuela's case, they went and sought other friends.
So I want to say this to all of you guys. I thought Aaron brought up really good points there, but I want to say this. We need to pay attention to what happens in Venezuela while Maduro is here in the United States, because if there was a time for these groups to rise and say that they are anti-Maduro, they're against him in Venezuela, it would be easier for them to do that now because he's not there. You get what I'm saying? So if we go back again to Iraq and we remember Saddam Hussein, the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein, and that gave rise to ISIS. That's how ISIS was able to come into, rise up the way that it did, because he wasn't there to keep that in check. And so I'm going to pay attention. And if I start to hear, news about, oh, look at these, there's gangs rising up in Venezuela, or, oh my God, there's radical Islamists rising up in Venezuela. I think people need to know that these are probably groups that are funded by the US or the CIA. And they'll use that for reasoning as well. Well, we got to get out of there. And well, we got to do this because we got to go fight these people now. And so sometimes the United States has been known to pay for these groups to exist. ISIS is another example, right? So pay attention to what happens in Venezuela while Maduro is here in the United States. Someone mentioned it in the chat as well, the color revolutions. Pay attention to things like that because he's not there. So he's not watching or able to keep those things in check. And then we also, again, we just got to go back to the Isaac Accords again. At the end of the day, don't forget about this. The Isaac Accords, which is a new initiative aimed at strengthening political, economic, and cultural cooperation between Israel and Latin America. That is a big one that people cannot forget about, right? So they want that to also happen. I think that Megyn, for whatever reason, I think she has a more difficult time criticizing Donald Trump. I feel like, like she may say, like I wonder about this action he just did in Venezuela, but she never goes all the way in, and says this, you are wrong for this. This isn't right. I can't support this. Right. So it makes you wonder what type of relationships that she's trying to keep. So that's something to think about. That's why I was very surprised when I saw that Aaron was on her show. But hopefully he was able to educate her viewers. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.